Tonight, we continue with our series of reports on media bias and conflicts of interest. We have started this series by focusing on the media in the United States, and interestingly enough, NPR, right, National Public Radio, and the interlocking that we found in our reporting that goes on between their board, their administration, and the administration of some major corporations in the United States, which is always a little hinky, right? Well, tonight we look at NBC News, right? Remember, they almost, as much as Fox, pushed the war in Iraq, right? They had the most to gain from it. Why? Why did NBC and MSNBC push the war in Iraq so much, even though it was all about lies? Well, according to some reports, they had 95% of the stuff that blew up in Iraq, you know, the ammunition, the bombs and all that stuff, was made by the company that owned NBC. You see the connection? If you don't, Michele Greenstein is going to take you through it. She's here now to take us through part 2 of our special series on media bias in America. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. What'd you learn?
So I guess let's begin with GE, since that's where you took it, and I'm glad you did there. Until recently, relatively recently, you know, GE did own NBC News, and it's not just the Iraq War. Even as far back as the Gulf War, GE either manufactured, supplied, or did maintenance for nearly every single weapon system that was used during the Gulf War, including the Tomahawk missiles, the B-52 bomber. Lots of aircrafts used their engines. Now, when it comes to Iraq, you could say, look, let's put it this way. You could say that, hey, who cares who owns it? What really matters is how they cover it, right? What if the ownership of NBC didn't affect their coverage at all?
Right.
But according to Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, the major networks during the lead up to the Iraq War, in just the weeks leading up to it, had guess how many guests on that questioned the Iraq War, that questioned the narrative or were anti-war?
Less than 20%?
One guest.
One guest.
In those weeks leading up to the Iraq War. That's right, including NBC. And also we have other examples, because GE also makes the weapons that Israel uses, that the U.S. sells to Israel, like the propulsion systems for aircrafts that are sold to Israel through the U.S., the F-16 Falcon, the Apache helicopters, the Black Hawk helicopters. So it makes sense that NBC would, you know, for example, downplay human rights violations of Israel or violations of international law, and of course, you know, go along with the other thing, which is that Israel is fighting terrorism.
So just to be clear, so our viewers understand what we're saying, the company that makes the weapons of war also owns the television news network that is apparently pushing us toward war.
Until 2011, yes, GE did own NBC. Well, let's first talk about what happened to the people who worked for NBC, because NBC actually has this history of pushing people out just for being anti-war. We had Ashley Bainfield, who was banished essentially as the Iraq War started to develop, after she gave a speech saying that the press shouldn't cover war in a jingoistic way, but she was kept in contract, so she couldn't talk about it. She couldn't go on any shows. A similar thing happened to... She was my colleague at the time, and so was Phil Donahue. Oh, I didn't realize. Yeah. Cool. A similar thing happened to Mr. Jesse Ventura. He had a show on MSNBC, but he didn't support the war in Iraq, so they paid him again, but he couldn't do any cable or news shows to talk about it, but they did cancel his show. And then, of course, there's Phil Donahue, who just 3 weeks before the invasion began was fired because he was an anti-war voice on this network that needed to start to push for this war. So even though GE doesn't own NBC outright anymore, there are still conflicts of interest, specifically when it comes to war and how war is being reported, that exist at NBC and its parent company, Comcast. So here is just some of the interlocking that's going on now. I'm going to take you through some of the board members right now of either Comcast or NBC. Okay. We have the Council on Foreign Relations, which has been said to be the closest thing to a ruling establishment in the U.S., which has major ties to Wall Street banks. It's a very hawkish think tank. We have the Carlyle Group, which is worth examining, and let's get back to that in a moment, because that's worth digging into. We've got banks, included J.P. Morgan and the Bank of New York Mellon Corporation. We've got the Securities and Exchange Commission. We've got Allied Financial, which is one of the companies that was bailed out, with GM and AIG, who's, you know, of course, as we know, executives got a pay hike right before. God. But just to go back to the Carlyle Group, which is worth examining, this is an investment firm with billions in assets whose defense holdings make it a major contractor for the Pentagon to this day. So it faced scrutiny in the past for, profiting from Afghanistan, from Iraq, and it does to this very day. And with ties to Saudi Arabia and some other nefarious countries in the Middle East. Fantastic reporting. We're out of time. Unfortunately. As usual, well done. Thank you, Rick. Good stuff. People need to know this. So you haven't heard that we're the ones covering the stories that you won't see covered
Anywhere else? In Venezuela, Kazakhstan. Let's go to Hong Kong. And the media reaction to that has been crickets. How about the way we cover those stories? What the hell does that mean? Huawei. That's the key word in this case, uprising. Keep? Can you believe that? Watching. This is the right thing for members of the media to do, to actually pick sides. Look, if you like what you see, subscribe.